The countdown on my screen read 6 hours. 6 hours until the end of everything I had ever known. I stared at the number until it blurred, and I still could not make myself believe it was real. My name is Daniel Cole, and I was a tactical officer aboard the human flagship Meridian, stationed at the edge of a star system that had, until 3 days ago, belonged to no one in particular. Now it belonged to a war. The message had come through every Allied channel at once, translated instantly into every known language, spoken in a calm and almost gentle voice that made the words feel even worse. The Zarthani Council, the governing body that had quietly managed peace and conflict across 100 star systems for longer than human civilization had existed, had reviewed every scrap of data on the coming battle between the human fleet and the Kesh Dominion Armada. Their supercomputer, a machine called the Eon Ledger, had run the numbers so many times that the Council trusted its answer the way a person trusts gravity. Humanity would lose, not might lose, would lose. Complete defeat was projected within 6 hours of first contact. I remember standing very still when I first heard it, my hand resting on the edge of my console, feeling the hum of the ship's systems through my fingertips like a heartbeat that did not yet know it was in danger. Around me, the bridge of the Meridian had gone quiet in a way I had never heard before. Usually, there was noise, chatter, the clatter of someone typing too fast, someone else laughing at something that was not funny just to release the pressure of the job. Now there was nothing, just the low mechanical breath of the ship and the soft blinking of alert lights across every panel. Captain Laura Bennett stood at the center of the bridge with her arms crossed, watching the same broadcast I was watching, her face unreadable. She was not a woman who let her expression give anything away. Not even now, not even with the fate of our species sitting on the table in front of her, like a verdict from a judge who had already made up their mind before the trial began. "They're not lying," said Ethan Marsh, our systems officer, from the console beside mine. His voice was quiet, almost apologetic, as if he wished he could disagree, but could not find a way to do it. "The Aeon Ledger has never been wrong, not once. Not in 300 years of recorded predictions." I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that machines could be wrong, that numbers could be wrong, that something as complicated as a battle could not possibly be reduced to a single verdict handed down before a single shot had been fired. But I did not say any of that, because somewhere underneath my fear, I was not sure I believed it myself. The Zartani were not a cruel species. That was the strange part. Their broadcast did not gloat. It did not threaten. It simply stated the outcome the way a weather report states the chance of rain, with a kind of detached certainty that felt almost worse than an insult would have. They were not trying to frighten us. They were trying to prepare us, the same way you might warn a child before pulling out a splinter. "This is going to hurt. This has already been decided. There is nothing you can do to change it." I looked out through the viewport at the stars beyond the Meridian's hull, calm and distant, and utterly indifferent to what was about to happen in front of them. Somewhere out there, beyond the edge of what our sensors could see, the Kesh Dominion fleet was already moving toward us, a wall of ships built by a species that had been fighting wars among the stars since before humans had learned to build fire into an engine. The Kesh were not new to this. They were old, disciplined, methodical. Their military doctrine had been refined over thousands of years of conflict, and the Zarthani Council, who had watched 1,000 young species rise and fall against exactly this kind of enemy, had seen this story before. New species, overconfident species. Species that thought courage could make up for the weight of centuries of preparation. I understood, in that moment, why they believed the outcome was already written. They had watched it happen again and again. They were not wrong to be certain. They were only wrong about us. Admiral Grace Whitfield's voice came through the ship's comm system a few minutes later, steady and clear, cutting through the silence on the bridge, like a hand reaching out to steady something that was about to fall. "I know what you've all just heard," she said. "I want you to hear something else too. That prediction was built on watching other species fight wars the way other species fight wars. It was not built on watching us. Nobody on the bridge said anything, but I felt something shift in the room, a small and fragile kind of hope that nobody wanted to speak out loud in case it broke. "We are not going to fight this battle the way they expect us to fight it," the Admiral continued. "We never intended to. Every plan we have built for this moment was built around one simple fact. They think they know how this ends because they think they know how we think. They do not." I did not fully understand what she meant, not yet, but something about the calm certainty in her voice reminded me of Captain Bennett's stillness, and I realized that the people in charge of this fleet were not panicking. They were not even surprised. It was as if they had expected this exact prediction, this exact broadcast, this exact moment of fear rippling through every crew on every human ship in the fleet, and they had already planned for it. Behind me, I heard someone quietly ask Ethan a question, and I heard him answer without turning around, his voice barely above a whisper. "The Council's model is built on watching how species behave under pressure, predictable patterns, escalation, retreat, negotiation, surrender. They've cataloged it all. It works because it's true almost every single time. Then why doesn't it work on us?" I asked, before I even realized I had spoken out loud. Ethan did turn around then, and for the first time since the broadcast had started, I saw something other than fear on his face. It was not quite a smile. It was something quieter than that, something closer to recognition. "Because we don't have thousands of years of pattern to draw from," he said. "We've only had a few hundred years of modern warfare, and every single one of them was different from the one before it. We don't have a doctrine the way the Kesh have a doctrine. We have improvisation, we have habit of changing tactics faster than anyone can study them." I thought about that for a long moment, turning it over in my mind the way you turn over a stone to see what is hiding underneath it. The Zarthani had built their prediction on the assumption that we would fight the way every other young species had fought before us, testing the waters carefully, posturing before committing, retreating the moment losses became severe enough to threaten morale. That was how wars were fought, according to the Council's long and careful study of 100 different star systems. That was how the pattern always went. But I had grown up on stories of wars that did not follow patterns at all. Wars where the side with fewer resources had won by refusing to fight the way their stronger enemy expected them to fight. Wars where the outcome had been decided not by who had the bigger fleet, but by who was willing to do something nobody had planned for. I looked around the bridge again, at the faces of people I had trained beside for years, people who were afraid, yes, but who were still at their stations, still watching their screens, still doing their jobs even as a machine that had never been wrong told them they were about to lose everything. Maybe that was the part the Aeon Ledger could not measure, not the tactics, not the ships, not the weapons, just the simple, stubborn refusal to accept a verdict before the trial had even started. The countdown on my screen ticked down another minute. 5 hours and 59 minutes until first contact, according to the Council's projection. I found myself doing something strange in that moment. I found myself hoping, quietly and without much evidence to support it, that the ancient and careful and endlessly experienced Zarthani Council, with all its centuries of watching wars unfold exactly the way they had unfolded 1,000 times before, had finally found a species they did not understand. Captain Bennett turned away from the viewport and looked out across the bridge, meeting the eyes of every officer in turn, including mine. "They gave us 6 hours, she said. "We're not going to need them." I did not know yet what she meant by that. I did not know what Admiral Whitfield and the Fleet Command had been planning for months before this moment, long before the Kesh Dominion had even finished assembling their armada. I did not know that somewhere in the depths of the Meridian and every other ship in our fleet, systems had already begun quietly preparing for something the Zarthani Council had never seen before, something that no ancient pattern of warfare could have predicted, because it had never been tried by anyone in the long and careful history the Council had studied. All I knew, standing on that bridge with the countdown ticking steadily downward, was that the fear in the room had begun to change into something else, something quieter, something sharper. 6 hours, the Council had said. I looked at the stars again, at the darkness where the Kesh fleet was somewhere approaching, and for the first time since the broadcast had begun, I let myself believe that the number on my screen was wrong. To understand why the Council believed so completely in their prediction, you have to understand what the Kesh Dominion actually was, and what it meant to face them. I spent the next hour reading through the intelligence briefings that Admiral Whitfield had ordered released to every officer on every ship, and the more I read, the more I understood why the Eon Ledger had been so confident. The Kesh Dominion had existed for over 4,000 years. In that time, they had fought and won more than 200 documented wars against other species across dozens of star systems. Their military structure was not something they had built quickly or carelessly. It was something they had refined generation after generation, the same way a river carves a canyon over millions of years, patiently, relentlessly, until the shape of it becomes almost perfect. Every Kesh warship followed the same command structure. Every fleet had a designated flagship carrying its highest-ranking officer, and every other ship in that fleet was trained to look to that flagship for direction before making any major decision. It was a system built on discipline and order, and it had worked for them for 4,000 years because it removed the possibility of confusion. Every captain knew exactly what was expected of them. Every soldier knew exactly where they stood in the chain of command. There was comfort in that kind of certainty, and there was strength in it too. An army that never has to guess what it should be doing can move with a kind of terrifying precision. The Zarthani Council understood this structure very well, because they had watched it succeed against species after species for centuries. Young civilizations, when they first encountered a threat like the Kesh Dominion, almost always responded the same way. They gathered their forces. They tried to match strength with strength. They postured. They negotiated. They probed carefully at the edges of the enemy fleet, testing for weakness the way a person tests ice before stepping onto a frozen lake. And when the ice held, when the Kesh fleet proved too disciplined and too coordinated to break, those young civilizations retreated, regrouped, and tried again with a slightly different approach, always circling closer to the same outcome: slow, grinding defeat, followed by negotiation from a position of weakness. The Aeon Ledger had been fed every detail of this pattern, drawn from centuries of recorded conflict. It did not need to guess how humanity would behave, because in the eyes of the Council, we were simply the next entry in a very long and very familiar list. New species, overconfident species. A species that would gather its fleet, posture bravely, and then discover exactly how far bravery could take you against 4,000 years of practiced warfare. What the Council did not know, and what the Aeon Ledger had never been given the chance to learn, was that humanity did not have a single military tradition the way the Kesh did. We had hundreds of them, scattered across our own history, constantly changing, constantly being replaced by something newer and stranger the moment the old way stopped working. I thought about this while I sat in the briefing room with Ethan and a dozen other officers, listening to Admiral Whitfield walk us through the plan that Fleet Command had been quietly developing for months. The Kesh fight from the top down, she explained, standing in front of a projection of their fleet formation, a tight and orderly cluster of warships arranged around a single massive flagship at the center. Every decision in their fleet passes through that flagship first. Their captains do not act without instruction. It is a strength when everything goes according to plan, and it is a weakness the moment it does not. They've never faced an enemy who could break that structure fast enough for it to matter, Ethan said quietly, more to himself than to the room. "No," the admiral agreed, "they haven't. Because most fleets that face them spend the first hours of a battle trying to survive contact, not trying to end it." She brought up a second image, this one showing our own fleet, spread out in a formation that looked almost careless compared to the tight and disciplined cluster of the Kesh ships. I remember frowning at it, wondering if the loose arrangement was some kind of mistake, before I realized that it was exactly the opposite. It was deliberate. It was designed to look uncertain, to look like exactly the kind of hesitant and disorganized formation the Council would expect from a young and frightened species facing its first real war. "We are not going to fight a battle of attrition," Admiral Whitfield said. "We are not going to trade losses with them hour after hour until one side breaks. That is the fight they are prepared for. That is the fight the Council has already predicted the outcome of, because they have watched it happen 1,000 times before." She paused, letting the silence settle over the room before she continued. "We are going to end this before that fight ever really begins." I felt something tighten in my chest, a mixture of fear and something else I did not have a name for yet. Around me, other officers were leaning forward slightly, listening more closely, and I realized that most of them, unlike me, already knew at least part of what was coming. This plan had not been built in the hours since the Council's broadcast. It had been built long before, in quiet rooms by people who had studied the Kesh Dominion carefully enough to understand exactly where their great strength became their great weakness. "Their entire fleet depends on command from a single point," the admiral continued. "Every ship in that armada is trained to wait for instruction from their flagship before committing to any major action. If that flagship goes silent, even for a few minutes, their entire formation does not know how to respond. They freeze. They wait for orders that are not coming, because in 4,000 years of warfare, they have never needed a plan for what happens when their chain of command simply stops working." I understood then what she meant, and I understood why the plan felt both brilliant and terrifying at the same time. We were not planning to win a long and grinding war of attrition against a fleet that had 4,000 years of experience fighting exactly that kind of war. We were planning to remove their ability to fight in an organized way at all, as quickly as possible, before their overwhelming numbers and discipline ever had the chance to matter. "This is not going to be safe," Admiral Whitfield said, and for the first time since she had begun speaking, I heard something almost gentle in her voice, an acknowledgement of exactly how much was being asked of everyone in that room. "The opening minutes of this engagement will be the most dangerous minutes any of us have ever lived through. We are asking every ship in this fleet to commit fully, immediately, without hesitation, in a way that goes against every instinct that tells you to hold back and assess the situation first. If we hesitate, even briefly, the numbers turn against us and the Council's prediction becomes exactly right." Nobody in the room spoke. I looked around at the faces of the other officers, some of them older than me, some of them younger, all of them carrying the same mixture of fear and something else, something that I slowly began to recognize in myself as well. It was not confidence exactly. It was closer to determination, the kind that does not depend on being certain of the outcome, only on being certain of what you are willing to try. Ethan leaned over toward me while the admiral continued outlining the details of the plan, describing coordinated strike waves and disruption patterns and 100 small technical details that I would need to understand perfectly in the hours ahead. "You know what the strangest part of all this is," he whispered. "What?" "The Council isn't wrong about anything they said. Not really. If we fought this the way they expect us to fight it, we would lose. Probably exactly the way they predicted, give or take an hour." I thought about that for a long moment, watching the projection of the two fleets hovering in the air above the table, the tight, disciplined cluster of the Kesh ships against the loose and deliberately misleading spread of our own. "So the plan isn't to prove them wrong about the numbers," I said slowly, understanding, beginning to settle into place. "No," Ethan agreed. "The plan is to make sure the numbers never get the chance to matter." The briefing continued for another hour, filled with details I would need to memorize before the fighting began. Coordinates, and timing windows, and contingency plans built inside other contingency plans. I listened as carefully as I could, but underneath the technical details, one thought kept circling back through my mind, quiet and persistent. The Zarthani Council had studied warfare across 100 star systems for longer than my entire species had existed. Their prediction was not built on ignorance or carelessness. It was built on centuries of careful, patient observation, refined again and again until it had become something close to certain. But observation could only tell you what had happened before. It could not tell you what a species capable of constant reinvention might try for the very first time, in the one moment when everything depended on it. By the time the briefing ended, the countdown on my screen read 4 hours and 12 minutes. Somewhere beyond the edge of our sensors, the Kesh Dominion fleet continued its slow and confident approach, moving with the calm certainty of an army that had never once needed to imagine losing. I gathered my notes, checked my equipment, and made my way toward my station, trying to hold on to the strange and fragile feeling that had settled into my chest since the briefing had begun. It was not quite hope. It was something steadier than that. It was the quiet understanding that everyone around me, from Admiral Whitfield down to the newest recruit on the lowest deck, had already decided that the Council's 6-hour prediction was not a sentence. It was simply a number that we intended to make irrelevant. The final hour passed faster than any hour I had ever lived through. I sat at my station on the bridge of the Meridian, watching the countdown fall away, minute by minute, until it read fewer than 60, and then fewer than 30, and then fewer than 10. Around me, the bridge had settled into a kind of focused quiet that felt very different from the fearful silence of hours before. People were still afraid. I could see it in the way Ethan's hands moved slightly faster than usual across his console, in the way Captain Bennett kept her jaw tight and her eyes fixed forward, but the fear had changed shape. It had become something we were using instead of something that was using us. At 3 minutes before contact, the first sensor readings of the Kesh Dominion fleet appeared on the main display, and the bridge went completely silent. I had studied the images from the intelligence briefings, but seeing the actual formation on our own sensors was different in a way I had not expected. The Kesh Armada stretched across the display in a tight and perfectly ordered cluster, hundreds of warships arranged in concentric rings around a single massive vessel at the center, a flagship so large that our sensors initially struggled to render its full size on the screen. It looked less like a fleet and more like a single enormous machine, every part of it moving in exact coordination with every other part, the product of 4,000 years spent perfecting a single terrible kind of harmony. "Confirmed," said the young sensor officer at the station beside mine, her voice tight but steady. "That's the Dominion flagship, designation unknown. It's broadcasting command signals to every ship in the formation, continuous update every 4 seconds. "Understood," Captain Bennett said. "Hold formation. Wait for the signal." I glanced at the countdown on my own screen. 90 seconds until the range window that Admiral Whitfield's plan depended on. The Kesh fleet continued its approach at a steady, unhurried pace, and I found myself thinking, in the strange sideways way your mind sometimes wanders in the moments before something enormous happens, that they were not even worried. Why would they be? Their supercomputer counterpart, the Council's Eon Ledger, had already told them how this would end. They had no reason to rush, no reason to be cautious, no reason to expect anything other than the same slow and grinding victory they had won so many times before. 60 seconds. I felt my pulse in my throat, steady but fast, and I made myself breathe slowly, the way I had trained to do 100 times before in simulations that had never felt anything like this. 40 seconds. "All strike wings reporting ready," came a voice over the comm, calm and clipped. 30 seconds. I looked at Ethan, and for just a moment he looked back at me, and neither of us said anything, because there was nothing left to say that would make the next few minutes any less terrifying or any less necessary. 10 seconds. Captain Bennett's voice cut through the silence, steady and clear. Execute. What happened next unfolded faster than I could fully process it in the moment, and it was only much later, replaying the sensor logs again and again, that I began to understand the full shape of what our fleet had done in those first critical minutes. The moment the range window opened, every human ship in the fleet moved at once, not in the slow and cautious advance the Council had predicted, but in a sudden, coordinated surge that scattered the loose formation we had been holding into dozens of smaller strike groups, each one already moving on a precise and pre-calculated path. It was not the disorganized panic it might have looked like from a distance. It was the opposite. It was the loose formation revealing itself, all at once, as a trap. Across the fleet, electronic warfare systems activated simultaneously, flooding the space between our ships and the Kesh Armada with a storm of false signals, sensor ghosts, and communication interference so dense that within seconds, the Dominion fleet's sensors were struggling to separate real targets from imaginary ones. I watched on my own display as dozens of false contacts bloomed across the battle space, human ships that did not exist, human formations that were nothing more than carefully crafted illusions designed to do exactly one thing: confuse the flagship's ability to issue clear and confident orders. Command signal frequency locked, the sensor officer beside me called out, her voice rising with something that was almost excitement. "We have their communication pattern. Deploy the strike drones," Captain Bennett ordered. I had known about this part of the plan from the briefing, but seeing it happen was something else entirely. Dozens of small, fast, unmanned vessels launched from carrier ships scattered throughout our fleet, moving not toward the main body of the Kesh Armada, but directly toward the flagship at its center, weaving through the storm of false sensor signals with a speed and precision that the Dominion's point defense systems, built to counter conventional attacks, struggled to track. On the main display, I watched the Kesh formation begin, for the very first time since the battle had started, to hesitate. It was subtle at first, barely visible in the chaos of the sensor data, but it was there. Ships that should have been moving to intercept our strike drones were instead holding position, waiting for confirmation from a flagship that was, in that exact moment, struggling to issue clear orders through a storm of false signals it had never been designed to filter. "Their outer ships are breaking formation," Ethan called out, disbelief creeping into his voice, even as he read the numbers directly off his own console. "They're not responding fast enough. They're waiting." That was the moment I finally understood, fully and completely, what Admiral Whitfield had meant in the briefing room. The Kesh Dominion's 4,000 years of disciplined, top-down command had made them one of the most effective military forces in the history of known space. It had also made them almost entirely dependent on a single point of control, a dependency so deep that they had never needed to build a plan for what happened when that control was disrupted, because in 4,000 years it never had been. The strike drones reached the flagship's outer defenses within minutes, and though the Dominion's automated systems destroyed most of them before they could get close, it did not matter. The drones had never been designed to destroy the flagship. They had been designed to overwhelm its defenses long enough for something else to get through. "Second wave," Captain Bennett said, her voice still perfectly steady, though I could see the tension in the way she gripped the edge of her console. The second wave was smaller, faster, and far more precise than the first. I watched on the display as a handful of specialized vessels broke away from our scattered formation and drove directly toward the flagship through the gap the first wave had created, moving with a speed that made my chest tighten with something between fear and awe. "They're targeting the command array," the sensor officer said, "not the hull, the communication systems." I understood then, with a clarity that felt almost dizzying, exactly what our fleet had been built to do from the very beginning. We were not trying to destroy the Kesh Dominion's flagship. We were trying to silence it, to cut the single thread that held their entire disciplined and terrifying formation together, and once that thread was cut, their 4,000 years of perfected doctrine would become, for the first time in their long history, a weakness instead of a strength. The moment the second wave struck, the command signal from the Dominion flagship went dark. For 3 full seconds, nothing happened on either side. The battlespace hung in a strange and terrible silence, both fleets suspended in the same frozen instant, and I found myself holding my breath without realizing I had done it. Then the Kesh formation began to fall apart. It did not happen all at once, and it was not the dramatic explosion of chaos I might have expected. It was worse than that, in a strange way. It was quiet. Ship after ship in the Dominion's outer rings, cut off from the central authority they had relied on for their entire existence, simply stopped moving forward. Some drifted. Some began issuing conflicting orders to each other, their independent captains, trained for centuries never to act without instruction, now suddenly forced to make decisions they had never been prepared to make alone. "Their formation is breaking," Ethan said, and this time there was no disbelief in his voice at all, only a kind of stunned recognition. "They don't know what to do." I watched on the display as our own fleet, no longer scattered, but now moving, with a sudden and coordinated purpose, began advancing through the gaps that had opened in the Dominion's collapsing formation, not toward destruction for its own sake, but toward disabling ship after ship, disrupting engines and weapons systems with a speed and precision that the confused and leaderless Kesh vessels could not match. I do not remember exactly how long the fighting lasted after that. Later, when I checked the official records, I found the number, and even now, it is strange to say out loud, 12 minutes. From the moment Captain Bennett gave the order to execute, to the moment the last organized resistance within the Dominion fleet collapsed into confusion and retreat, only 12 minutes had passed. 12 minutes, against a prediction of 6 hours. I remember the moment the bridge realized what had happened, not through any announcement, but through the sudden and overwhelming silence that fell across the sensor displays as the Kesh Dominion's remaining ships began breaking away from the battlespace entirely, scattering in directions that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the simple, desperate confusion of an army that had lost the only voice it had ever known how to follow. Captain Bennett stood very still at the center of the bridge, watching the display as the last of the Dominion ships retreated beyond the range of our sensors. Nobody spoke. Nobody cheered. I think, in that moment, all of us were still too stunned by what had just happened to fully understand it. I looked down at the countdown that had been sitting on my screen for hours, the number the Zartani Council had given us with such calm and terrible certainty. It still read something over 5 hours remaining. 5 hours we had never needed. Somewhere far beyond the edge of the battlespace, I imagined the Zartani Council watching the same sensor data we were watching, the same 12 minutes replaying again and again on whatever screens they used to monitor a war they had already decided the outcome of, and I wondered, for the first time since the broadcast had begun, what it must feel like to watch a certainty you have held for centuries simply stop being true. The hours that followed the battle felt strange in a way I had not expected. I had imagined, if I had let myself imagine anything at all, that victory would feel loud, full of relief and celebration and noise. Instead, the bridge of the Meridian remained quiet for a long time, filled with a kind of careful disbelief, as if everyone was waiting for someone to tell us the numbers had been wrong, that the battle was not actually over, that somewhere beyond our sensors the Kesh Dominion fleet was regrouping for a second and more terrible attempt. But no such message came. Instead, less than an hour after the last Dominion ship retreated beyond our sensor range, we received something else entirely. A transmission request, routed through the same Allied channel the Council had used to broadcast their original prediction, requesting a live connection to Fleet Command. Admiral Whitfield accepted the request from her own command ship, and Captain Bennett arranged for the transmission to be shared across every bridge in the fleet, including ours. I remember leaning forward slightly in my seat as the display flickered and resolved into an image I had never seen before. Not in any briefing, not in any historical record. The Zarthani Council chamber itself. I do not know exactly what I expected the council to look like. Something grand, perhaps, something built to reflect the weight of the authority they held over so many star systems. What I saw instead was simpler than that, and somehow more unsettling because of it. A wide circular room, its walls lined with softly glowing displays, at the center of which stood a small group of Zartani representatives, tall and slender figures with pale, luminous skin and eyes that seemed to hold an unusual stillness. Behind them, dominating the far wall of the chamber, was a massive display that I recognized instantly. It was still showing the sensor data from our battle, frozen on the exact moment the Kesh Dominion formation had begun to collapse. One of the Zarthani stepped forward, and though I could not read the subtle details of their expression the way I could read a human face, something in the careful stillness of their posture told me that whatever they were about to say, it was not going to come easily to them. "I am Counselor Vesik Thalor," the figure said, their voice translated instantly into a calm and even tone that did not fully mask a certain tightness underneath it. "I am speaking on behalf of the Zarthani Council and on behalf of the Aeon Ledger's Analysis Division." Admiral Whitfield's voice came through the connection, steady and measured. "We're listening." There was a pause, brief but noticeable, before the counselor continued. 6 hours ago, this council issued a formal projection regarding the outcome of the engagement between the human fleet and the Kesh Dominion Armada. That projection was built upon the most complete and carefully verified dataset our civilization has ever compiled, drawn from centuries of observed conflict across dozens of star systems. It has never, in the history of its use, been proven meaningfully incorrect. I glanced sideways at Ethan, who was watching the transmission with an expression I could not quite name, somewhere between disbelief and something almost sympathetic. "The engagement concluded in 12 minutes, Counselor Thalor continued, and even through the careful neutrality of the translation, I thought I could hear something underneath the words, something that in a human voice might have sounded like quiet astonishment. The Kesh Dominion fleet suffered a near-total command collapse within the first 4 minutes of contact. This outcome falls so far outside the range of our projection that our analysis division has spent the last several hours attempting to determine whether an error occurred in either our sensor data or our modeling process." "And what did you determine?" Admiral Whitfield asked. Another pause, longer this time. "No error occurred," the counselor said finally. "The data is accurate, the outcome is genuine. The failure, if it can be called that, was not in our observation of the battle, it was in our understanding of the species we were observing." I felt something shift in the room around me, a quiet ripple of reaction that no one spoke aloud, but that I could feel all the same, a mixture of relief and something that was harder to name, something close to pride, though it did not feel like the kind of pride I had expected to feel if we ever survived this day. "Our projection model," the counselor continued, "was built upon an assumption that has held true across every young species we have observed entering interstellar conflict for the last several thousand years. We assumed that a species new to warfare on this scale would rely on a single military tradition, refined slowly over time, tested cautiously against a stronger enemy before being escalated. This assumption has never failed us before. It's not that we don't have military tradition," Admiral Whitfield said. "It's that we've never had just one." I watched Counselor Thalor go very still for a moment, and I found myself thinking, strangely, that the gesture looked almost exactly like the way a human might pause to absorb something they had not fully expected to hear. "Please explain," the counselor said. Admiral Whitfield glanced briefly toward one of her aides before continuing, and I got the sense that she had been waiting for exactly this question, perhaps even hoping for it. "Humanity has fought thousands of wars across our own history, Counselor. Different eras, different technologies, different cultures, different reasons. Every time one method of warfare proved effective, someone found a way to defeat it, and the method that replaced it looked nothing like the one before. We don't have 4,000 years of a single refined doctrine. We have a few hundred years of constant reinvention, forced on us again and again by the simple fact that whatever we tried before eventually stopped working. And your fleet command anticipated that the Kesh Dominion's doctrine, despite its long success, would contain a vulnerability that 4,000 years of unbroken tradition had never required them to address. Counselor Thaler said slowly, as if working through the logic out loud for the benefit of the rest of the council chamber behind them. "We didn't anticipate it," Admiral Whitfield said. "We looked for it. There's a difference. Your Aeon Ledger studies what species have done before. We spend a great deal of our time studying what an enemy has never had to do before, because that's usually where the weakness is hiding." The council chamber behind Counselor Thaler had gone very quiet, and I found myself watching the other figures gathered there, their pale and still faces turned toward the massive display still showing the frozen image of the Kesh Dominion fleet breaking apart. I could not read their expressions with any real confidence, but something in the stillness of the room felt heavier than simple observation. It felt like an old and confident institution quietly confronting the limits of its own certainty for what might have been the first time in a very long while. "This outcome," Counselor Thaler said finally, "will require a complete revision of our projection model as it applies to your species. The Aeon Ledger's assessment of humanity as a predictable young civilization following established patterns of gradual military escalation is no longer valid." "What does that mean for us going forward?" Admiral Whitfield asked. There was a pause before the counselor answered, and when they did, their voice carried a note of something that felt, even through the careful neutrality of the translation, almost like respect. "It means the Council will be reclassifying your species' threat and capability tier. It means future engagements involving humanity will no longer be modeled using the same historical assumptions we have relied upon for centuries. And it means, Admiral, that this Council will be approaching any future contact with your civilization with considerably more caution than we extended to you 6 hours ago." I felt a strange kind of quiet settle over the bridge as the transmission continued, a feeling that was not quite triumph, but something steadier and more thoughtful than that. I thought about the 6 hours the Council had given us, the calm and certain voice that had told an entire civilization it was about to lose everything, and I thought about how strange it was that the same careful and ancient wisdom that had made that prediction so confident was now the very thing forcing the Council to admit, openly and without excuse, that they had been wrong. "There is one more matter," Counselor Thaler said, and something in their tone shifted slightly, becoming, if I was reading the translation correctly, almost cautious. "The Kesh Dominion will not accept this outcome quietly. Their command structure has suffered a defeat unlike any they have experienced in recorded memory. There is a strong likelihood they will regard this loss not as a reason to withdraw, but as a reason to return with greater force and different tactics." "We understand that," Admiral Whitfield said. "We're not expecting this to be the last time we hear from them." "Then I would advise," the counselor said, "that you continue doing whatever it is your species does that our models have never been able to properly predict." I did not know it then, sitting on the bridge of the Meridian in the quiet aftermath of a battle that had ended in 12 minutes instead of 6 hours, but that single piece of advice from a counselor who represented one of the oldest and most careful civilizations among the stars would turn out to matter a great deal in the days that followed. For now, though, all I could do was sit with the strange and heavy silence of the moment, watching the transmission slowly fade from the display, and try to understand what it meant that an institution old enough to have watched 100 civilizations rise and fall had just admitted, in front of every human fleet listening, that it did not fully understand us at all. 3 days after the battle, I stood in the observation deck of the Meridian, watching the slow rotation of the stars outside, and I found it strange how ordinary everything looked now. the same darkness, the same distant points of light. Nothing about the universe outside our hull had changed, and yet everything about how I understood our place within it felt entirely different. Admiral Whitfield had not allowed the fleet to celebrate, not in any loud or careless way. She had gathered every ship's command staff for a brief address the day after the battle, standing in front of a display that showed not our victory, but a long list of names, the crew members we had lost, even in 12 short minutes of fighting. Fewer than anyone had feared, far fewer than the Council's prediction would have suggested, but not none. She had reminded us, in a quiet and steady voice, that a fast victory was still a victory bought at a cost, and that the cost deserved to be remembered honestly rather than buried under celebration. I thought about that often in the days that followed, as reports began arriving from across the fleet, and eventually from far beyond it, describing how word of the battle had begun to spread through the wider network of star systems the Zarthani Council quietly oversaw. It was strange to think that a battle lasting only 12 minutes had already become something people in dozens of systems, species I had never met, and would likely never meet, were now discussing with a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. On the fourth day, Captain Bennett called me to her quarters, along with Ethan and a handful of other officers who had worked closely on the tactical planning for the engagement. I did not know what to expect. Part of me worried, despite everything, that some new complication had arisen, some flaw in our victory that had only now become apparent. Instead, I found her standing beside a small view screen, and on it, a formal request had already been prepared and transmitted from Admiral Whitfield's command, addressed not to the Kesh Dominion, but to the Zarthani Council itself. "We're not interested in continuing this the way it started," Captain Bennett said, once we had all gathered. "The Admiral has sent a request for formal negotiation, both with the Council, regarding humanity's status among the Allied systems, and with the Dominion, regarding the terms of a lasting peace." "They tried to conquer us," said one of the younger officers, a woman named Claire Whitmore, who had served alongside me for nearly 2 years. There was no anger in her voice, only a kind of careful confusion. Why would we offer them peace, instead of pressing whatever advantage we have now? Captain Bennett considered the question for a moment before answering, and when she did, her voice carried the same steady calm I had come to associate with everyone in Fleet Command who had known, long before any of the rest of us, exactly what kind of battle they were preparing to fight. "Because the goal was never to prove we could beat them," she said. "The goal was to prove that trying to conquer us would cost more than it was worth. There's a difference between winning a fight and winning a peace, and only one of those actually protects people in the long run." I thought about that for a long time afterward, turning it over in my mind the way I had turned over so many other strange and unfamiliar ideas in the days since the Council's original broadcast. We had ended the battle in 12 minutes, a number so far outside of anyone's expectation that it had forced one of the oldest and most careful institutions among the stars to admit, openly, that its centuries of certainty had failed it. We could have used that shock, that sudden and overwhelming demonstration of unpredictability, to press for far more than a simple peace. Other species, watching the same battle unfold, might have done exactly that. Instead, the message Admiral Whitfield sent, and that I later read in full once it had been shared across the fleet, was almost disarmingly simple. It offered a set of coordinates for a neutral meeting point, a request for formal talks regarding humanity's future status among the Allied systems, and a clear and direct statement that humanity had no interest in expanding this conflict any further than it had already gone. The Zarthani Council's response came faster than I expected, arriving within a single day, carried by the same Councillor Vesic Thalor who had spoken to us in the aftermath of the battle. This time, the conversation was shorter and far less formal in tone. "Your Admiral's proposal has been reviewed and accepted," Councillor Thalor said, appearing once again on the shared bridge display, though this time, the stillness in their posture felt different, less guarded than before. "The Council finds it, I will admit, somewhat unusual." Unusual how? Admiral Whitfield asked. Every species we have observed achieving a victory of this magnitude against the Kesh Dominion has used it, at minimum, as leverage to extract significant concessions, the counselor said. Territory, resources, formal recognition of expanded influence. Your request contains none of these things. You have asked only for peace and for the opportunity to be understood on your own terms, rather than through the lens of species that came before you. That's the only thing we were ever fighting for, Admiral Whitfield said simply. There was a long pause on the other end of the transmission, and I found myself, once again, trying to read the subtle stillness of an alien expression I did not fully understand, searching for some sign of what the counselor might be thinking behind the careful neutrality of the translation. The Aeon Ledger's revised model for your species remains incomplete, Counselor Thaler said finally. We anticipated aggression following a victory of this scale. We did not anticipate restraint. It seems our understanding of humanity will require considerably more revision than we originally believed. I remember smiling faintly at that, standing near the back of the bridge and glancing at Ethan, who wore an expression that mixed quiet amusement with something more thoughtful underneath it. Maybe that's the part your model was always missing, Ethan said quietly, more to me than to the wider conversation happening across the transmission. It's not just that we fight differently, it's that we don't measure winning the same way you'd expect us to. The formal talks that followed took place over the next several weeks, conducted at the neutral coordinates the Council had provided, far from either human or Dominion territory. I was not present for most of them, my role limited to reviewing tactical summaries and preparing data for the officers who represented our fleet directly, but I followed the reports closely, along with the rest of the crew, watching as the shape of a new relationship between humanity and the wider community of star systems slowly began to take form. The Kesh Dominion, as Counselor Thaler had warned, did not surrender easily or gracefully. Their formal response to the battle's outcome, delivered weeks later through Council channels, carried little of the calm acceptance the Zarthani had shown. It was measured, careful, and unmistakably wary, the tone of a civilization that had built its entire identity around military dominance, now forced to reconsider what that dominance actually meant in the face of an enemy their doctrine had never prepared them to face. There would be no lasting friendship between our fleet and the Dominion Armada, not soon, and perhaps not for a very long time. But there was, at least, a fragile and carefully worded agreement to withdraw from further engagement, to respect the boundaries Admiral Whitfield's negotiators had proposed, and to enter, however reluctantly, into a longer process of diplomatic contact overseen by the Council. It was not the kind of ending I might have imagined, back on that first day, staring at a countdown that promised total defeat within 6 hours. There was no parade, no grand celebration, no dramatic declaration of humanity's arrival among the stars as a dominant new power. What there was, instead, felt quieter and somehow more meaningful. A slow, careful shift in the way an ancient and cautious council began to speak about us, no longer as a young species following a predictable path toward eventual defeat or eventual conquest, but as something they did not yet fully understand and had learned, through hard experience, to treat with genuine respect. I thought often, in the months that followed, about the strange irony sitting at the center of everything that had happened. The Zartani Council had spent centuries building the most careful and thorough system for predicting the outcome of conflict that any civilization among the stars had ever developed. They had watched 100 young species rise, struggle, and eventually fall into familiar and predictable patterns, and their confidence in that system had been, by every reasonable measure, well earned. What they had never accounted for was a species that had spent its entire history refusing to stay predictable for very long. A species built not around a single perfected tradition, but around the constant, restless habit of throwing away whatever had stopped working and trying something new before anyone, including ourselves, had the chance to fully understand what we had just done. On the day the Council formally revised humanity's threat and capability tier within their long-running catalog of known species, Ethan showed me the updated entry, pulled from a public summary the Council had shared across the Allied network. It was short, far shorter than the detailed and confident entries written about older and more thoroughly understood civilizations, and I remember reading it more than once, unable to stop myself from smiling faintly at the careful, almost cautious language the Council had chosen. Threat assessment for species designation, human, incomplete. Behavioral pattern, highly variable. Historical precedent, limited applicability. Recommendation, continued observation, with significant caution. I stood on the observation deck of the Meridian one final time before we were reassigned to a new post along the edge of Council territory, watching the same slow rotation of stars that had once felt so indifferent to everything happening around them. I thought about the 6 hours the Council had once promised us, the calm and certain voice explaining, with centuries of careful evidence behind it, that our defeat was already decided before the first shot had ever been fired. 12 minutes, I thought. 12 minutes had been enough to rewrite everything an ancient civilization believed it understood about how a war was supposed to end. I did not know what the years ahead would bring, whether the fragile peace with the Kesh Dominion would hold, or whether other species, watching from the edges of Council territory, would look at what had happened to us and decide humanity was a threat worth eliminating quickly, before we had the chance to surprise anyone else the way we had surprised the Council. I did not know how many more battles were still waiting somewhere ahead of us, or how many more predictions built on centuries of careful observation we would eventually be asked to prove wrong. But standing there, watching the stars turn slowly outside the viewport, I found that I was no longer afraid of the uncertainty the way I had been on that very first day, staring at a countdown that had once felt like a sentence rather than a number. The Council had spent centuries learning how to predict the way species destroyed each other, slowly and carefully, over long grinding wars that followed patterns old enough to be trusted. We had shown them something they had never needed to learn before. Not simply how to win quickly, but how to choose, once the fighting had ended, exactly what kind of victory was actually worth having. And somewhere far beyond the edge of what our sensors could see, I like to imagine, the Eon Ledger was still quietly working through the numbers, trying to understand a species that had never once given it enough time to be right.